Today, Monday, 17th June, the international media, to the extent that they want to discuss the topic at all, are mulling over the failure of the so-called peace summit for Ukraine, which has just ended in Lucerne in Switzerland. Now, by far the best account that I know of what actually happened at the summit has been provided by the former British diplomat Ian Proud on his blog, and which is, by the way, entitled Ian Proud, and the title of the article is "Zelensky's Peace Formula is Dead, Might Take Away from the Swiss Summit." And this is what Ian Proud has to say about it. In what was an echo chamber for Ukraine's allies to encourage Zelensky to continue to reject formal peace talks with Russia, the Swiss summit delivered nothing. Of the 82 signatories to the communiqué, 45 were European countries, including non-EU members. There were 4 European institutions and 5 other Western allies that have sanctioned Russia, including Japan, add in Israel, which is a US client state. That makes 55 countries and institutions. And then Ian Proud goes on to point out that of the 27 non-Western allies who signed the communiqué, there was a very limited number showing from mostly smaller Asian and Pacific countries, 6 in total, Latin American, 9, and African states. The Global South was turned off by this initiative. And as Ian Proud also says, the Middle East completely turned its back on the summit, given almost unconditional support for Israel's actions in Gaza. Middle Eastern countries turned their back on the summit and final communiqué. They were most likely turned off by a US-engineered peace initiative for Ukraine that, much like US efforts in Gaza, seek to support one side over another in the conflict. Only Qatar, which is playing an active role in negotiating prisoner handovers, associated itself with the communiqué. Now, there's been some reports that were circulating yesterday in the Western media that 2 Arab states, Jordan and Iraq, had signed the final communiqué. It seems, in fact, this has been confirmed, it was an error. The Swiss authorities have now confirmed that, in fact, these 2 countries did not sign the communiqué. They refused to do so, contrary to what was previously reported. So the reports yesterday spoke of 80 countries, 80 states signing the communiqué and 12 refusing to do so. In fact, it was 14 that refused to do so. These are countries, I should make clear, which actually chose to attend the summit. 14 of the countries that attended the summit refused to do so. Not 12, and as I understand, amongst states, the total number of states that signed the final communiqué was 78. Now, that it corresponds with Ian Proud's total of 82 signatories, of which 78 were states and 4 were Europe-based international institutions, one of which I suppose was the European Union, though I'm not completely sure. 78 states. And of those 78 states, some of them almost certainly signed the final communiqué, not because they have any real belief in its contents, but because they face overwhelming pressure from the Western powers, first and foremost from the United States, and they concluded that it was dangerous for them to stay away from this summit meeting, and that it was dangerous for them not to sign the communique. Three of these countries being, of course, Hungary, Turkey, and Serbia, all three of which have spoken out strongly against Western policy over the conflict in Ukraine, all three of which have expressed their misgivings, their clear misgivings about the direction that the conflict has been taking, but all of three of which decided that it was in their best interests to attend this summit and to sign off to the communique itself. And as Ian Proud says, the communique itself was, to all intents and purposes, an empty vessel. And again, I'm going to read what he says. Whilst Western media have claimed the communique endorsed Ukraine's territorial integrity as a basis for a just and lasting peace, this isn't correct. A core part of Zelensky's so-called peace formula is the requirement that restoring Ukraine's 1991 borders is core to reaching any peace deal. This is highlighted under the umbrella of the fourth point of Article 2 of the UN Charter that states should refrain in their international relations from the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other matter inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. However, Russia claims that NATO expansion is including towards Ukraine is a threat to its state under the same clause of the UN Charter. The communique wording is therefore ambiguous on this point. Russia might argue that the final paragraph of the text refers to its rights as much as to Ukraine's rights. At best, the communique was therefore inconclusive on territorial integrity. This confirms my assessment, that's to say Ian Proud's assessment, that any future deal, peace deal, will require Ukraine to make compromises based on the battlefield realities, which are not likely to shift. Now, I have read Ian Proud's words because, of course, he is a former diplomat, a former British diplomat, which by definition I am not, and this is somebody with from a diplomatic background reading what the communique in effect says. So the communique is an empty vessel. I don't think that Ukraine or the Western powers have actually turned their backs on the demand that the Russians withdraw completely from Ukraine to their 2014 borders, giving up Crimea as well, which is, of course, Zelensky's plan. But in order to get countries to sign up to the communique, they felt that they had to fudge the issue, which is what they have done. Even then, as I said, 78 states signed out of the 92 which attended. And, of course, 92 is already a significant reduction from the 160 which were invited, apparently invited. Now, going beyond this, it's perhaps worth pointing out who were the states which refused to sign the communique and or attend the summit, because as even some outlets in the West, like the Financial Times and the Guardian, are very grudgingly admitted, the most powerful countries in the world, outside the Western alliance, all refused either to attend the summit or to sign the communique if they did send representatives to the summit. China refused to participate in the summit in any way. And obviously, They were not, therefore, invited to sign the communique. India sent representatives, though apparently at a relatively low level. The Indian representative spoke out against the format of the Swiss summit. He's reported as saying that in order for there to be peace, there have to be good faith negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. A summit meeting from which Russia is included is obviously not a venue at which a genuine process towards peace can be achieved. And India refused to sign the final communique. Brazil played an even more ambiguous role. They said that they weren't attending, but they would send an observer who apparently did not participate. And the observer obviously did not sign the communique. Other countries that refused to sign the communique were Mexico and Indonesia and Thailand. In fact, all of the BRIC states, none of the BRIC states signed the communique. Saudi Arabia, under intense pressure from Ukraine and the United States, sent its foreign minister. The foreign minister, again, as I discussed in my program yesterday, spoke also of the imperative need to involve the Russians in discussions. Saudi Arabia refused to sign the communique. Other countries, as Ian Proud says, in the Middle East, basically either boycotted the conference entirely, countries like Egypt, for example, or refused to sign the final communique, despite sending representatives like Jordan and Iraq. The only Arab state that signed was Qatar, and again, as Ian Proud says, Qatar probably signed because it is playing a role in mediating prisoner exchanges between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it doesn't want to jeopardize its position as a mediator. So, a shambles. From what I can understand, none of the important Latin American countries signed, apart from Argentina, whose President Milei, is a fervent supporter of the West and has reversed Argentina's recent course of alignment with the BRICS, with President Milei now becoming an outspoken supporter of both Israel and Ukraine. But all of the other big Latin American countries, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Colombia refused to participate. Mexico did participate apparently, but also refused to sign the communique. So, a shambles, a weak communique, which doesn't say quite what people have been led to think it means, but a communique which nonetheless most countries around the world, an absolute majority of countries around the world, do not want to be associated with. They've either stayed away from the conference entirely, or if they've attended, a significant number of them refused to sign it. And all of the major powers, the big, powerful countries outside the West, as I said, none of them agreed to sign off to this communique. This summit has been dreadful. It has been a major miscalculation by whoever it was who first conceived it. What it has demonstrated, in fact, is not the extent of support for Ukraine, but rather the extent to which support for Ukraine and the Western position on the Ukraine war is draining away. Now, to understand that, perhaps the best way to look at this is to look at the two UN votes that previously happened over the conflict in Ukraine. I'm talking about the votes that took place in the UN General Assembly directly after the Russian army advanced into Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. There was a meeting of the General Assembly. The General Assembly voted by a very considerable margin. From my recollection, over 140 states to condemn Russia's invasion, as it was described, and in effect to demand the withdrawal of Russian troops. Even at that time, key states in the global south, like China and, from recollection, India, refused to support that General Assembly vote. But the number of countries that are now coming forward and signing up to a communiqué, which in effect is a watered-down version of that original General Assembly resolution, has now dwindled to 78, of which, as Ian Proud correctly says, a clear majority were European states, along with the United States and some of its other key allies. So, as I said, a shambles. Now, I'm going to say that I think some major mistakes were made during the conference itself, which probably on the margins reduced support for the communiqué even further from what perhaps it might have been. Now, as Ian Proud correctly says, the communiqué actually fudges the question of Ukraine's territorial integrity. But it contained two provisions which were both extremely far-fetched and took a clear pro-Ukrainian line. There was a reference to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and that effectively required the Russians to hand back its control to Ukraine. Everybody present must have known that that wasn't going to happen. Everybody in the room, certainly in the global south, will have known that the party that has really been shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power station is Ukraine. So that would have also acted as a deterrent for some countries, probably, to vote to decline to sign the communiqué. And then there was a further clause that demanded the return of deported and unlawfully displaced Ukrainian children, which is, of course, a reference to the case that's been brought against President Putin in the International Criminal Court, and which, in effect, required states to take sides on that case and to do so in a way that was hostile to President Putin. And again, it's difficult to imagine that countries led by leaders like Prime Minister Modi of India and President Lula of Brazil and MBS of Saudi Arabia, all of whom count themselves as President Putin's friends, would agree to a communiqué that contained a provision like that. It's very strange that these provisions were included in the draft of the communiqué that leaders from around the world were invited to sign. But there it was. So mistakes like that were made. I'm going to suggest that there were also mistakes made by some of the European leaders who attended. Now, some of them, particularly some of them from Eastern Europe, spoke in a way that basically highlighted the fact that their real interest is not ending the conflict in Ukraine, but erasing Russia itself from the map. President Duda of Poland spoke about the decolonization of Russia, which is an obvious and straightforward incitement to non-Slavic peoples within the Russian Federation to secede and break away from Russia, and for the breakup of the Russian state. Now, that would have alarmed many governments around the world already. Many governments around the world, India, for example, is one, Indonesia is another, Brazil is a third, also contain ethnic communities within their borders, talking about Russia being the prison of the nations, a famous phrase dating from before the First World War, sometimes, I believe, incorrectly attributed to Vladimir Lenin. Anyway, calling Russia the prison of the nations, as President Duda did, and inciting ethnic minorities within Russia to break away, would have been deeply alarming and something which many nations, as I said, multi-ethnic nations like India and Indonesia and the others, and certain African states would certainly not want to countenance. And of course, talking in that fashion, at one and the same time as demanding Ukraine's territorial integrity within its 1991 borders, must have seemed to some leaders as obviously self-serving and contradictory. It will have reinforced the belief amongst some leaders from around the world that there are at least some countries within the collective West who are not really so interested in Ukraine itself and who do not actually have any real desire or wish to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, but who are instead using the Ukrainian conflict as a mechanism to destabilize and overturn Russia. And the fact that none of the leaders of any of the major Western states, not the United States, not Germany, not France, not Britain, not Italy, not Spain, spoke out against these really over-the-top words that came from the President of Poland and the leaders of some of the Baltic states, well, all of that, again, would have reinforced the doubts that many countries in the global south have about Western policy over the conflict in Ukraine. It baffles me. I have to say, I find it very surprising that governments within NATO, including very powerful governments, do not understand that much of their rhetoric is making Putin's and Russia's case for them where global South opinion is concerned. So, major mistakes made at the conference itself, mistakes made over the wording of the communiqué, mistakes in the speeches. I say mistakes. Of course, President Duda and the Baltic leaders will not have considered their absolutely intemperate and wild comments as mistakes. They reflect, on the contrary, their deeply held and very visceral beliefs and wishes. But anyway, altogether, a conference which I think will have reinforced the widespread view outside the West that it is the West, not Russia, that is actually responsible for the war and which seems to be intent on prolonging it as it pursues geopolitical objectives which are not only existentially dangerous for Russia, but which ultimately are all about achieving Western dominance and perpetuating it in ways that most global South countries absolutely do not want to see. So, a conference that, in my opinion, backfired. And, of course, another factor played its part too, because on the eve of the conference, President Putin delivered his massive address to the personnel, the senior personnel of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the one in which he set out his proposals for a settlement of the conflict, what I have referred to as Istanbul Plus, the provisions, in other words, the basic provisions agreed in Istanbul, plus Ukraine's complete withdrawal and, in effect, cession of the four regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk, as well, of course, as Crimea itself. Now, from what I've heard, even though Western leaders didn't want to talk about the speech that Putin made and his proposal at any length in the conference, in the Swiss conference, in private, especially on the first day, it was the major topic of discussion. All sorts of people apparently were huddled together, talking with each other about whether Putin means what he intends and what the Ukrainians should do and about what the West should do. And of course there's been a rather extraordinary thing happen for which I have no fully satisfactory explanation. And that is that the New York Times has now published the almost complete documentation of what was agreed in Istanbul. Now, this is most surprising, and as I said, there's no real explanation for why it happened. The documents that the New York Times has produced shows that there was a draft that was 70 to 80% agreed, that there was still an awful lot of work to do. The Russians were raising objections to some of the provisions that the Ukrainians were floating. I have to say that all of these sort of handwritten notes that set out Russian objections to the draft look to me like matters that it might have been possible to negotiate over, in fact should have been possible to negotiate over. They were not in any respect, as far as I can tell, deal breakers, though I know that there is a line of thought that says that they were, and that's what the New York Times perhaps is trying to hint at. But anyway, we have Istanbul, the essential outlines of what was agreed at Istanbul now provided to us, with one very important omission. We learn, for example, that the guarantees that were to be provided to Ukraine would not cover Crimea and certain territories. The New York Times has not provided us with the document which outlines what those territories were. But in fact, I know, and I remember this very well because it was discussed at massive length by various Ukrainian officials back in March 2022 when the negotiations appeared to have crystallized and an agreement was just round the corner. Well, the Ukrainians at that time were themselves quite openly saying that the territories that would not be covered by the guarantees were the two regions of the Donbass. I suspect, by the way, that the reason that the Ukrainians don't want this, and I'm sure it was the Ukrainians who were prevailed upon to provide these texts, I'm sure that the reason the Ukrainians and the Americans do not want this part of Istanbul to be publicized is because there's been an attempt to claim that the Russians agreed to pull back to the pre-February 2022 front lines. And I'm going to say that my own understanding always has been that the guarantees were not intended to apply to the entirety of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, the actual regions, not the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, but to the entire territory of these regions, which therefore was intended to pass, in effect, under Russian control. The Ukrainians and their American backers are still hesitant about publicizing the scale of the concessions that the Ukrainians were, in fact, prepared to make. I would add that many of the details of the Istanbul agreements that one can now read also, to my mind, suggest that the Ukrainians were at least considering making more substantive concessions on issues like demilitarization and denazification than they were telling the media was the case back in March 2022. But anyway, we come back to the basic question. Why publicize all of these documents now? Now, of course, there are possible explanations. One of them is that this is purely reporting by the New York Times. The journalists at the New York Times, they've been hearing an awful lot about the Istanbul Agreement. They've decided it's time to find out what it was, and on their own initiative, they've done what reporters are supposed to do. They've engaged in some investigative reporting, and they have managed to get their hands on all of these documents. That's one possibility. I'm afraid it is not the possibility that I believe. I think that the most likely explanation is that with Putin now talking about Istanbul Plus, that there is at least one line of thought within the United States, one faction if we prefer, maybe the people who would prefer to focus on China, that they've decided that some sort of means to settle the war is essential. And since Putin is talking about Istanbul, the time has come, since there has to be a settlement, to inform the Western public, or at least the elite Western public, about what the Istanbul terms actually were, so as to see whether or not, if they do form a basis for negotiations, the Russians can perhaps be prevailed to revisit them and to modify them and to retreat back to them away from the Istanbul Plus demands that Putin is now making. That's, I admit, an optimistic interpretation, though very qualified optimism nonetheless. But anyway, there we are. The very fact that this document appeared when it did, at a time when Putin is talking about Istanbul Plus, and it's quite likely that the Americans had some advance notice from the Russians about what it was that Putin was going to say to the Foreign Ministry Board. The very fact that this is all being floated out, and is being talked about in that way, brings us back to the point that I've already made, which is that Putin dominated the conference in Lucerne with this speech, even if he was not actually invited to attend it. So there we are, a disastrous conference, one which has highlighted the hollowing out of support across the world for Ukraine, or at least for the policies that the West is following towards Russia in connection with the West's proxy war in Ukraine, the extent to which global opinion is quietly swinging behind Russia in terms of this conflict, and which, I should say, if President Zelensky's actual intention in holding this conference was to demonstrate the support for him from world leaders, well, that didn't turn out so well either. Just to repeat, President Zelensky is currently president of Ukraine. He, not on the basis of his having been re-elected to that office after his term ended, but because he has extended martial law in Ukraine and claims that this means that as a result of the martial law decree, presidential elections cannot occur, and his term as president is extended automatically thereby. Now, that is President Zelensky's view. President Putin in Russia disagrees. There are plenty of people in Ukraine who disagree. As I have said on previous occasions, I am going to maintain a complete agnosticism over this issue. But the point is that Zelensky knows that there are criticisms and challenges to his position. So, of course, he wants as many world leaders as possible to turn up to the summit in Lucerne to meet with him, so that he can be photographed with them, so that he can bask in their reflected glory and tell the people of Ukraine and perhaps the Russians that despite all the question marks over his status, he is nonetheless the legitimate president of Ukraine, because after all these leaders from around the world accept him as such. Except, as I said, that it didn't quite turn out that way. President Biden didn't go. Now, President Biden was, just the day before, in Apulia, in Italy, attending a G7 summit meeting there. One would have thought that it would be an easy thing for him to get onto his jet and fly to Switzerland, the neighbouring country, and attend the conference in Lucerne. After all, I suspect that the conference in Lucerne was timed to enable that very thing to happen. It was done so that it would be easy for President Biden to extend his stay in Europe by 1 or 2 or 3 days, so that he could go straight from Italy to Switzerland. After the G7 summit, he would be able to go to Switzerland, meet Zelensky, and preside over this successful summit, which would end in the Russians being handed their ultimatum. That, I suspect, was the original plan. However, when it became clear that more and more countries would not go, that Xi Jinping, for example, would not go, that Modi and Lula would not go, that the summit would end in failure, President Biden, or perhaps his campaign managers and other members of his team, decided that he should not go after all. And instead, Vice President Kamala Harris went, and she stayed for a few hours, gave her speech, which is identical to those that all of the other Western leaders made in terms of its substance anyway, And then, of course, instead of staying and hanging around and meeting people and engaging in some diplomacy, she got on her jet as soon as she could and flew back to the United States. And Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, also cut short his presence at the summit meeting so that he could attend a meeting in Germany of his Social Democratic Party, which is struggling with issues of involving or concerning the national budget. And of course Meloni was there from Italy and Macron was there from France, but the two of them seemed to be at odds with each other. They had a massive row at the preceding G7 summit, and it doesn't look as if that was a particularly successful coming together of those two leaders in Switzerland either. And anyway, one way or the other, the whole setup, the attempt to make the summit into a triumph for Zelensky, didn't come off. In fact, he was eclipsed at the summit in ways that he must have found unnerving by his own deputy, or to be more precise, his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, who came along with Zelensky, not clear why, and spent his time conducting many of the meetings with the foreign leaders that one might have expected Zelensky himself to undertake, thereby reinforcing the widely held view in Ukraine and outside that it is not Zelensky who is really in control and running things in Kiev, but that he is basically a puppet whose strings are being pulled by Yermak. I don't know, by the way, whether that is really the case, and I would point out that Yermak is not an elected political leader in Ukraine, and he does not, so far as I know, have his own power base. He is in a position of power and authority purely because he is Zelensky's chief of staff. My own view is that he and Zelensky stand and fall together. That's my own view. I think people who see Yermak as a potential successor or replacement for Zelensky are simply wrong. But anyway, there we go. A dreadful summit, a pointless summit. Pointless in the sense that it should never have been organised at all. This is not the time to hold a summit like this. But not pointless or worthless in terms of what it has shown us. And that is, as I said, to repeat once more, support around the world for the Western position on Ukraine is draining away. We saw that in the comparison between the number of states who signed the final communique and the much larger number of states which back in March 2022 were prepared to vote for a pro-Ukrainian resolution at the UN General Assembly. Now, there is another aspect to this conference, and it's a disturbing one, because in the run-up to that conference, and apparently at the conference itself, a whole succession of stories have started to appear in the Western media that Ukraine's current military crisis is only temporary. When the mobilization is completed or has run its course, when Ukraine is rearmed as a result of all the new flow of weapons from the United States and Europe that are trickling in Ukraine's directions, when all of that happens, Ukraine perhaps at the end of 2024 or the beginning of 2025, we'll be able to go back on the offensive, recover all the ground it's lost, and push the Russians into negotiations in which Ukraine will be negotiating from a position of strength. I think all of this is completely delusional. There's no doubt at all that many thousands of people are being mobilized. I saw a report today that most of the people who are being mobilized are being given 6 weeks training. 6 weeks training. In some cases, it is much less even than this. Most of them, obviously, are people who do not want to fight in the war and who are not as reliable soldiers as those who fought for Ukraine previously were. And as for Western weapons, well, Ukraine is indeed receiving weapons from the West. The Biden administration has been sending one arms package after another to Ukraine ever since that vote by the House of Representatives some months ago on blocking the $61 billion package, of which, as I've said already, $13.8 billion was weapons for Ukraine. They appear to be running, by the way, through that $13.8 billion very fast. All kinds of accountancy tricks are apparently being used to make it easier to increase the number of arms, so that, for example, weapons are being sent to Ukraine at the nominal price, are being priced at the nominal values that they had when they were first produced. So, for example, if we're talking about a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, if it was produced in 1985, when it might have cost $1 million, it's priced by the administration as costing $1 million, as opposed to, say, the $3 million that it might cost today. I'm not claiming, by the way, these are not actual figures of what Bradley's cost, either in 1985 or today. I'm just illustrating the accountancy device that's being used. But the point is that whatever numbers of weapons are being used, are being supplied, they're nowhere near enough to make up for the needs that Ukraine has. In fact, there were reports that Ukraine is now using a lot of the money it's getting from the West to try to buy Soviet-era weapons and ammunition on the international arms markets, that it's been driven to do that because of the general shortage of Western weapons, but that it's finding that these Soviet-era weapons are in relatively short supply, and that the arms dealers that Ukraine is forced to deal with are constantly raising their prices. So there is no short-term solution for Ukraine's problems. There is no long-term solution for Ukraine's problems. Ukraine's problems are only going to continue to get worse and worse. So for Zelensky and Yermak and other Ukrainian officials to tell the world, to tell Western leaders, to tell the global South leaders, to tell their own people, to tell people in the Western media that, just hold out a little more, we'll turn it round, all you need to do is to give us another $50 billion and we can still win the war and go back on the offensive in 2025, and we understand that you want us now to negotiate, but we can't negotiate now when we're losing, but if you give us a little bit more time and a few more weapons and a bit more money, a couple of tens of billions more, a couple of million more rounds of ammunition, well, then we'll be in a better position because we can negotiate from a stronger position at that point. Well, that is a cruel deception. It is not going to happen. On the contrary, Ukraine's actual position, as anybody who follows the situation closely on the front lines can see, continues to deteriorate every day. Losses continue to be unbelievably high. This morning, I totted up the numbers of dead and wounded published by the Russian Defense Ministry, that it claims that Ukraine has suffered in the fighting over the course of today. Obviously, what is morning for me is late afternoon in Ukraine and Russia. And I found that the number is something like 1,750. Now, that's an unbearable, unsustainable level of loss. On some days, Ukraine is losing men at the rate of more than 2,000 a day. Now, of course, some will say that these are Russian figures, that they cannot be true, but I have every reason to believe that they are within a ballpark guesstimate of being true. Otherwise, why are we hearing so much about Ukrainian manpower shortages? And why was Ukraine's former military chief, General Zelensky, saying at the end of last year that Ukraine's army needed 500,000 men more just to fill the gaps? So this is, as I said, a cruel deception. It is an equally cruel deception to think that piling on pressure on China is going to make is going to compel China to change course. I'm going to come to that later in this program. And, well, realistically, there is nothing that can happen that is going to make the situation change course. The American military media is saying that the Ukrainian pilots for the F-16s are minimally trained. I read an article in the Financial Times that spoke about the surge in recruitment for the West's military industries. So I went with interest to see what the surge in recruitment amounted to. Well, one company's taking on a couple of hundred people, another a few more, perhaps 1,000, increasing its workforce by perhaps 10% over what it was previous to the war. The total numbers seem to be in the low 10,000s. This against a Russian military industrial complex that employs 3.5 million people and which is continuing to grow. So it is a cruel deception to pretend that this situation on the front lines can be reversed. But of course, the Ukrainians are not drawing any conclusions from this. Zelensky and Yermak, as I discussed in a program I did about 2 days ago, they are not going to accept Putin's proposals. They don't really, I think, even want to see peace. At least they do not want to see a peace in anything that falls short of total victory for Ukraine. Because now their entire future, their position as, in Zelensky's case, president of Ukraine, and Yermak's case as chief of staff to Zelensky, who is the president of Ukraine, and perhaps as the de facto leader of Ukraine, which many people believe Yermak is. All of that now hinges on the war being carried on. Russian leaders are now saying this. In fact, there's been statements to this effect from the Russians today. We've had comments, for example, from none other than Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman. And he said this: at one time, Zelensky came to power under the banner of peace and the intention to establish peace to save Ukraine. He always said that he did not hold on to the chair, that was the presidency. He always said that he was ready to do anything for the sake of his motherland. Let's see if he's ready for anything so as not to further further damage the situation, further worsen the situation. Every time Putin voices peace initiatives, and when attempts are made to enter the political and diplomatic channel, there are certain conditions on the ground. Each time they worsen for Ukraine. The current dynamics of the state of affairs on the fronts clearly shows that it will continue to worsen for Ukraine. Probably a politician who puts the interests of his motherland above his own and above his masters would think about such a proposal. Let's see what happens. And in effect, he goes on to say that the Russians basically believe that Zelensky is clinging on because he doesn't actually place the interests of his motherland above his own interests, that he's clinging on because he wants to continue the war, because his own survival, certainly as Ukraine's president, is now linked to that. And of course, it isn't just Peskov who is saying that if the Ukrainians don't come to terms, the next demands will be harsher. We've seen other Russian officials who said that this is Ukraine's last chance. Putin's proposals are Ukraine's last chance. But Sergei Narishkin, who is Russia's intelligence chief and who is a member of Russia's Security Council, he's now said this: the conditions on which peace can be achieved and some sort of a peace agreement may be signed will become more complex and more tough for Ukraine if Ukraine refuses President Putin's peace offer. He said this very simply. So from now on, with every day, Ukraine's position weakens and its scope in negotiations reduces, with Russian leaders, other Russian leaders, talking openly about the only acceptable outcome now being surrender of Ukraine. Well, there we are. An unsuccessful conference. Delusional thinking and language coming from Zelensky and Yermak. Attempts from Peskov and Narishkin on the Russian side to get the Ukrainians to understand the impossible position they are in, and a West which looks to me increasingly disengaged from a process it doesn't know how to end and which it doesn't fully understand how to continue. Now, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has now said that within NATO there is now talk about putting nuclear weapons, NATO's nuclear weapons, and he's talking about tactical nuclear weapons, on a higher alert status. And of course he's linking this clearly to the moves that the Russians have been taking themselves to back the warnings that they have been giving over the last few weeks, ever since the plans to deploy NATO troops to Ukraine floated by President Macron first started to appear, and ever since this disastrous idea of launching deep missile strikes inside Russia using Western missiles was floated as well. Now, the West has been going out of its way to say that it believes that these Russian warnings are bluffs, that the Russians are bluffing. And yet we see Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, talking about putting NATO's own nuclear weapons on a higher alert status. That strongly suggests that there are some people within NATO who understand perfectly well that the Russians mean what they're saying and that they are not bluffing. Otherwise, why take a step like this? The Russians, of course, have hit back, and they said that Stoltenberg's proposals to increase the alertness status of their nuclear forces is escalatory, more escalation. On the one hand, the fact that it's clear that the West, or at least some people in the West, don't think the Russians are bluffing. That seems to me to be a good thing. But also, and given the fanaticism with which some people like Stoltenberg are bringing to this whole proxy war in Ukraine, the fact that there are people in NATO who are now talking about putting NATO nuclear weapons on an alert status shows again how in the void, the policy void that now exists, there is a real danger. There is an ever-present danger that the situation will in the end spiral out of control. Well, there we go. A peace conference that has failed, peace summit that has failed, that has exposed Western diplomatic weakness, a clear Russian plan going forward. What is the situation on the battlefronts? Well, we've had much more news this morning from the battlefronts in Ukraine, and all of it, as far as I can see, is negative for the Ukrainians. We've had more reports from battle group of forces north. They are giving us some further ideas as to what is happening with the situation in the Kharkiv area. Now, I want to stress again a point I've made many times. I don't actually believe that Kharkiv is the main battlefield in the Ukraine conflict. The main battlefronts, as far as I'm concerned, are the Avdiivka, Ocheretino, Krasnogorovka, Marinka area, perhaps also extending to Chasiv Yar, the area, in other words, of central Donbass. That's where the big battle is happening, the area which the Russians consider to be, to use the German word, the Schwerpunkt. The Kharkiv battle is to some extent a sideshow, but it's an important sideshow, if only because the Ukrainians themselves attach so much focus to it. Now, I said yesterday that the latest reports have once and for all buried the theory that the Russian troops in the aggregate plant were surrounded by the Ukrainians and were trapped there. The reports, both the visual reports and the previous report from Group of Forces North, show that the Russians have strong supply lines. They control territory, and that their troops fighting inside the aggregate plant have not, in fact, been surrounded. Now, yesterday, the Military Summary Channel, based, as far as I could tell, on a single report from a Ukrainian source, came up with a rather complicated explanation for the contradictory reports on this that we've been getting. They said that what happened was that back in May, the Russians were able to insert a special forces unit onto the territory of the aggregate plant, before the main Russian forces had reached the aggregate plant. And this Special Forces unit occupied part of the territory of the aggregate plant, was itself indeed surrounded for several weeks, but that the forces of Battle Group North over the last couple of days have finally reached it and have linked up with it, thus establishing a stable corridor from the main Russian forces to the aggregate plant. Now, that kind of thing does happen in war. We saw something like that happen during the Battle of Avdiivka, when the Russians used an underwater pipe to insert a Special Forces unit behind Ukrainian lines, an event which contributed to the ultimate collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Avdiivka. So it is not impossible that something like this scenario has indeed played out. But I have to say that there have been no reports of anything like that from Group of Forces North themselves, and I've not seen any claims about Russian troops being trapped in the aggregate plant come from the Ukrainians over the course of May or thereafter, which I would have expected to see. So, without saying that this claim is false, I'm going to say straight away I'm extremely sceptical about it. But what is Group of Forces North telling us about the situation now? They say this: in the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in the town of Volchansk. This is, by the way, as of yesterday. Active fighting has developed on the eastern outskirts of the city. The enemy attacked our positions 15 times during the day from the direction of the village of Tikhoye, simultaneously trying to transfer reinforcements from the south across the Volcha River. Apart from senseless losses of up to 100 men and loss of positions, the enemy did not achieve anything and was thrown back. No Ukrainian activity was observed in the area of the high-rise buildings. The total advance of the Russian troops in Volchansk direction was up to 300 meters. So that sounds like a major Russian advance yesterday in Volchansk. Notice that there is no reference here to the aggregate plant. They're saying that they repelled counterattacks and that they gained ground, but they're not mentioning the aggregate plant. Now, this morning, a cluster of mappers, neutral and, by the way, as I understand it, pro-Ukrainian, are claiming that the Russians have now captured the entire territory of the aggregate plant. Now, this would not be the first time that that claim has been made, but perhaps it is true, in which case we see a major crisis for the Ukrainians in Volchansk. It looks like their attempts to counterattack in Volchansk have failed, and that the troops in the citadel, the high-rise building area, are now indeed trapped, and there's even a claim that the Ukrainian command now understands in the area that northern Volchansk is lost, and presumably the men of the 71st Jaeger Brigade in the citadel area, the area of the high-rise buildings, that it's lost also. There were Ukrainian counterattacks, according to Group of Forces North, in the Lipsy area towards the village of Glubokoye. Again, the military summary channel has some pictures, and they show us where those counterattacks took place. They imply, the military summary channel implies, that the counterattack might have gained some ground. The Group of Forces North suggest otherwise. They say in the Lipsy direction, we repulsed a Ukrainian counterattack of up to 50 men supported by 2 armoured personnel carriers near the village of Glubokoye. Up to 10 enemy troops were killed, and both armoured personnel carriers were burned. And in fact, we have photos of one of them being burned. I mean, it seems to me that more likely than not, there was well, there definitely was a Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainians temporarily occupied some ground, and the Russians recaptured it. But then Group of Forces North says this, and this is a curious political commentary. As I said, Group of Forces North appears to have something of a personality as opposed to other Russian army units, but they say this: the enemy is conducting combat reconnaissance and over the past 24 hours has concentrated its efforts on the eastern flank of Volchansk. The Ukrainian command is waiting for an opportune moment to bring a strike group of its forces into battle, but it has been unable so far to find a weak spot in our defences. Zelensky, having returned from Switzerland, will surely demand results from his generals, so the beginning of a counter-offensive of the main forces of the Ukrainians in this area is only a matter of time. Having failed to achieve victories on the diplomatic front, the Kiev regime will want to rehabilitate itself on the battlefield, and our task is to prevent the enemy from realizing its plans. As I said, remarkable clarity about Russian plans from this particular Telegram channel, an official Russian Defense Ministry authorized Telegram channel. They expect a major Ukrainian counterattack in the Volchansk area. They've been busy establishing their positions. There's lots of pictures apparently of engineering vehicles, Russian engineering vehicles building fortifications in the area. They're preparing for this counterattack. Maybe they've captured the aggregate plant and the citadel area will collapse. We'll see. But one way or the other, they think that with the debacle in Switzerland, a furious Zelensky is going to return to Kiev and is going to demand another offensive. After all, he's been telling everybody that for all the fact that Ukraine is suffering losses everywhere along the battlefronts, Ukraine will be able to take the initiative soon again and reverse the course of events. I've said that this is, in my opinion, a cruel deception, but he will, at least in his own mind, feel almost certainly that he needs a victory, a palpable success somewhere, in order to make this deception appear convincing. And Group of Forces North, General Lapin and his staff, the commanders of Group of Forces North, assume that the counterattack will happen in the Volchansk area and they're preparing their defences. All very interesting, and we shall see how it plays out. Let me repeat that the Schwerpunkt, in my opinion, the focus of the battle lies elsewhere. The Russians continuing to bomb and shell the western buildings, the westernmost buildings of the micro-district in Chasov Yar, but making no attempt for the moment to storm it. But the Russians now focused very strongly on their advance west of Ocheretino and Avdiivka. There were many reports of the Russians gaining more ground in all of these villages to the west of Ocheretino and Avdiivka, pressing further and closer all the time to the road that links Pokrovsk to the west with Konstantinovka to the east. There's been an explanation provided, by the way, of what cutting this supply line will do. As I said in my program yesterday, the Ukrainians in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka will not be completely cut off from supplies. Supplies will simply be redirected and will reach them through other routes. But there was a long explanation of all of this in the Russian newspaper Redovka. The point was that the supply lines from Pokrovsk also provide supplies to the Ukrainian troops west of the Russian-held city of Gorlovka, in places like Toretsk and New York. If the supply lines, if the road is cut, then the Ukrainians will have to send supplies to those troops in west of Gorlovka, in Toretsk and New York, from Konstantinovka, which of course is just west of Chasiv Yar. And the supplies that are being sent to Konstantinovka up to this point have been used to maintain the positions of the Ukrainian forces in Chasiv Yar. So if the Ukrainians decide to cling on to their positions in Toretsk and New York, west of Gorlovka, and the reports say, by the way, that Zelensky has made it absolutely clear that there is to be no retreat from these places either, then the Ukrainian logistical routes through Konstantinovka will become overloaded by the need to maintain supplies to two different fronts, the Gorlovka and the Chasiv Yar front, at one and the same time. An interesting article, almost, one might say, written in response to my comments of yesterday, except, of course, that it wasn't. I'm sure that it was written entirely independently, but it answered my question. But anyway, the Russians very close, apparently, to capturing the, reaching this road. They are now bombing and shelling the village immediately to the south of the road. All the indications are that they're preparing to storm this village, and Ukrainian resistance in this area looks like it is all but non-existent. It is essentially collapsed. And there are reports also that Ukrainian resistance in what is left of Krasnogorovka has also collapsed, and that the Russians have now cleared the last remaining high-rise buildings that the Ukrainians still occupied in the northwest of Krasnogorovka. So now it's only small, low-lying buildings, easy to capture, that lie before the Russians. And, of course, the Russians also advancing, apparently, through the village of Maximilianovka, closing in on Kurakhovo as well. And as I said at the start of earlier in this program, the Russians claiming that Ukraine has suffered losses over the course just of today of 1,700 plus men, a level of loss that is completely unsustainable for an army the size of Ukraine's. Now, I have discussed in previous programs, including I think yesterday's, how there is still a belief in the West, among some people, that the economic war that the United States is preparing to wage against China will somehow bend China into submission over the question of the conflict in Ukraine, and will cause the Russians to break their support for Russia. There has been a scorching article in Global Times about this, and it's written by GT Global Times staff reporters. So this is clearly an article which has been put together by the entire team at Global Times. And it says quite straightforwardly that the United States and China are now heading for outright confrontation. Hypocritical G7 communique targets China, aiming to lay groundwork for camp confrontation. The fact that G7 Apulia leaders communique mentioned China over 20 times is no surprise to Chinese analysts, who said on Saturday that the elaborately crafted, hypocritical declaration reveals the US-led West's attempt to shift blame to China, whilst the US aims to lay the groundwork for future camp confrontation. And then the article says that most of the global south is not willing to be drawn into this battle, that China is being attacked and criticised on every front for its exports, for its support for Russia, over the Taiwan issue, over the climate crisis, over cyber security, over the South China Sea, on human rights questions, that this is incredible hypocrisy, and especially, it's also ill-conceived at a time when all Western countries are facing growing domestic, political and economic problems. And the article says it is completely unreasonable to attribute the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict to normal China-Russia trade when all countries around the world continue to engage in trade with Russia. As we've seen, the EU now imports, or at least did in May, imported more gas in May from Russia than it did from the United States. This overlooks the fact that irresponsible actions by Western countries have exacerbated the losses suffered by Ukraine. And they quote a Chinese expert as saying they are trying to divide the world into different camps, using the Ukraine crisis as an opportunity. In fact, this approach not only fails to solve the crisis itself, but poses a threat to global security in a broader region. Such an arrangement by the West is actually very inappropriate. The Chinese are not going to bend. What they can see is that the West is actually coming after them. That, as this Chinese expert says, the West is using, or rather the United States, is using the crisis in Ukraine as a further tool to increase its pressure on China. And this might explain a very strange article which has just appeared in the Financial Times, recently appeared in the Financial Times, which claims that Xi Jinping told European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen that Washington is trying to goad Beijing into attacking Taiwan, and that he apparently would not take the bait, and that he has given warnings to other Chinese officials not to fall for this either, and that apparently Xi Jinping told Ursula von der Leyen that if there is a conflict with China, he understands that all of his achievements, that a conflict with the United States would destroy many of China's achievements and undermine his goal of achieving a great rejuvenation by 2049. Now, I have major doubts about the full truth of this article. Firstly, I find it inconceivable that Xi Jinping would open up to Ursula von der Leyen in this way. Of all people, if he wanted to impart information like this, he would not have given it, I would have thought, to Ursula von der Leyen. Secondly, in meeting after meeting with Western officials, including with President Biden, according to Chinese readouts, Xi Jinping has gone out of his way to make clear that for China, Taiwan and the issue of Taiwanese independence is a red line. Why would Xi Jinping undermine his own red line in a conversation with Ursula von der Leyen, of all people? I'm reading this article as something completely different. First, an attempt to reassure people in the West that the Chinese are bluffing over Taiwan, that they don't really intend to fight for Taiwan in the way that they say, and also as a potential warning to Xi Jinping himself, pointing out to Xi Jinping that if he is prepared to fight the Americans over Taiwan, then this will destroy many of China's achievements and undermine his goal of achieving a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. That is my take of this article. But we can see that the ground is shifting, that the United States, or at least the present leadership of the United States, are thinking increasingly now of a conflict with China. And the Chinese, as the Global Times article shows, understand this very well. And contrary to what many people think, I think this will not cause the Chinese to weaken their support for Russia. I think that will make them increase it instead. And in fact, I believe that there is an article in the Washington Post, which I haven't found, which says that some people in the Biden administration believe that China has now made a decision to actually increase its military support for Russia over the course of the conflict in Ukraine. Well, there we go. This is a complex geopolitical game that is being played out. Stoltenberg's decision to put NATO nuclear forces on alert highlights it's an incredibly dangerous game. But the key takeaway of the events of the last couple of days is the diplomatic international support for the West has weakened. The ill-starred Lucerne summit has ended up highlighting that fact. And in the meantime, the military situation in Ukraine continues to go badly for Ukraine, and the Russians are hardening their stance. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop and buy yourself all the amazing things that you will find there. Our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts and all those great things. And also, if I can just point out, our new Football 24 line. You'll see that I have one with a football in the middle. That's, I believe, the flag of Scotland, just saying. But you can find all those shirts there in our range. They're all there in our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick this like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.